The night shift at Mercy General began the same way it always did, with Margaret Walsh moving through the ICU corridors like a ghost made of muscle memory and 18 months of practiced invisibility. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous drone overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made 3 in the morning feel like it existed outside of time. She pushed the med cart with her right hand, the wheels squeaking softly against tile that smelled of antiseptic and something underneath it, something organic that no amount of bleach could fully erase. Her scrubs were navy blue, unremarkable, the kind that blended into every other nurse walking these halls. That was the point. Room 314 was 3 doors down on the left. She knew the patient's vitals by heart now, stable, improving, no signs of infection. A Navy SEAL, 26 years old, recovering from injury sustained in Kandahar. Shrapnel had caught him on the right side 3 weeks ago, and he'd been transferred stateside for the final phases of healing. His name was Michael Chen. She had not told him she knew who he was. She had not told anyone anything. Margaret entered the room without knocking. Nurses didn't knock, they moved through space as if they owned it, and immediately scanned the monitors. Heart rate 68, steady. Blood pressure 118/76. Oxygen saturation holding at 98% on room air. Everything was textbook recovery. Everything was exactly where it should be. She adjusted the 4 bag without touching the line itself, checking the infusion rate, making sure the saline was flowing at the correct milliliters per hour. Her hands moved with a precision that came from somewhere deeper than nursing school, some part of her that remembered when these same hands had held tourniquets tight while helicopters thundered overhead and people were screaming. Michael's eyes opened slowly. The head trauma had left him with something the discharge notes called mild disorientation, which meant he sometimes forgot faces and sometimes asked the same questions 3 times in an hour. Today, his pupils tracked her movement with reasonable clarity. Reasonable for a man whose skull had been fractured and repaired with titanium plates. You ever been in a fight? His voice was rough, textured with the remains of intubation tubes. You've got that look. Margaret didn't pause. Her hands continued their work, checking the dressing on his abdomen, noting the slight seepage of fluid that indicated normal healing, no infection. What look? The look like you've seen things. Bad things. And you didn't break. He shifted slightly, wincing. I've seen it in other guys. Guys who came back. She adjusted his pillows without answering and made a note on his chart in handwriting that was deliberately generic, nothing distinctive, nothing that would stick in anyone's memory. The medical record for room 314 would show exactly what they wanted it to show, a competent nurse providing standard care. Nothing more. Nothing less. She was good at being nothing more. As she moved toward the door, Michael's hand reached out. Not to grab, he was too weak for that, but to gesture. His left forearm was wrapped in compression bandages from wrist to elbow, part of the standard post-operative care for his injuries. Beneath the gauze, something was visible. A tattoo. A name, maybe. The bandages covered most of it, but she could see the edges of black ink, the shape of letters. She felt her heart do something it shouldn't do. Accelerate. She made it to the door before she let her expression change. The break room smelled like stale coffee and the particular despair that accumulated in hospital staff spaces at 3 in the morning. Margaret set her chart down on the small table next to the refrigerator, the same spot where she always set it, the same position, nothing that would draw attention, and moved to her locker. She had a routine here too. Open the locker. Retrieve the cracked coffee mug. The mug had broken 3 years ago, and she'd glued it back together with epoxy. The glue was visible, the break line still prominent, but it held liquid. It held what was important. She filled the mug with coffee from the machine in the corner, the dark liquid steaming slightly. Next to where the mug had been, there was a photograph. She did not look at it directly, but she was aware of it the way a person is aware of a loaded weapon in a room. The photo was small, 4x6, and it showed 11 people in desert camouflage standing in front of a Humvee with the sun beating down like judgment. She had been second from the left. That had been 12 years ago. That had been before everything else. The succulent on her shelf was dying. It had been a gift from someone, a hospital volunteer, she thought, though the memory was vague and unimportant, and Margaret had kept it out of obligation rather than any belief that it would survive. Most things didn't survive when Margaret was around. That's quite a collection you've got there. She didn't start. Her hand didn't jump. Her coffee didn't slosh. She had trained for this, for the moment when someone would notice something that shouldn't be noticed, and she had trained specifically to never show it when they did. She turned with the casual slowness of someone who had simply been lost in thought, and found Dr. Richard Hargrove standing in the doorway of the break room, his silk tie catching the fluorescent light like a predator's eye. He was tall, somewhere in his late 50s, with the kind of face that came from good genetics and expensive dermatology. His hands were soft. Margaret had noticed that first, 18 months ago when she'd arrived at Mercy General. His hands were soft in a way that suggested he hadn't performed actual medicine in decades, if ever. But he wore a lab coat like a uniform, and he moved through the hospital corridors with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned. "Just keeping my space organized," Margaret said. Her voice was even, unremarkable. A nurse's voice. A woman who made $38,000 a year and didn't think about things too deeply. Hargrove stepped fully into the break room and closed the door behind him. That was interesting. People who closed doors in hospital break rooms usually wanted something. Usually wanted control over the space. "You've been here 18 months. It wasn't a question. He moved toward the refrigerator with the kind of casual ownership that suggested he'd been here longer, that these spaces belonged to him in some fundamental way. "How are you finding things?" "Fine, Dr. Hargrove. It's a good hospital." "Is it?" He opened the refrigerator, though he didn't appear to be looking for anything specific. The door swung open, and cold air spilled out, carrying the smell of old yogurt and something else, something that had been there so long it had transcended the category of food and become a philosophical statement about entropy. "I've been here 23 years. I think it's the best hospital in San Diego. The best medicine. The best staff." Margaret had her hands on the edge of her locker, and she deliberately didn't move them. Movement would look suspicious. Stillness looked like nothing. "I'm sure you're right." "You're very careful," Hargrove said. He closed the refrigerator and turned to face her. "I've noticed. The way you chart. The way you observe. Very thorough. Very sharp." He smiled, and there was something in the smile that made the air in the room feel different, denser, the way the air felt before a thunderstorm. Some might say too sharp for a night shift nurse. She met his eyes then. Not a challenge. Just a look. A professional acknowledgement. "I like to do my job well, Doctor." "Of course you do." He adjusted his tie, though it didn't need adjusting. Everything about him needed adjusting, some fundamental recalibration that would make him less of what he was, but Margaret was not in the business of adjusting people. She was in the business of observing them. Of noting the discrepancies. "You know, I was reviewing some of the billing for the ICU yesterday. Very thorough records. Everything tracked perfectly. Every patient accounted for. Every procedure documented." He paused. His eyes were on her locker now, on the photograph with the desert and the 11 people and the Humvee. That kind of care is rare these days. Most people don't pay attention. "I pay attention," Margaret said. "Yes," Hargrove agreed. "You do. That's what concerns me." He left then, and the door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded exactly like a lock engaging, though there was no lock on the break room door. Margaret stood without moving for 11 seconds. She counted them, the way she counted everything, and then she looked down at her hands. They were steady. The hands of a nurse. The hands of someone who had once held a tourniquet tight enough to stop an arterial bleed while dust and chaos filled the air around her. Those hands did not tremble. They had been trained not to tremble. She looked at the photograph, really looked at it this time. The second figure from the left, that was her. That was Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, before she had become just Margaret, just a nurse, just someone who was careful and precise and invisible. The figure to her right was Petty Officer First Class Michael Chen, his arm around her shoulders, both of them squinting into the sun like they believed they might actually survive what came next. The coffee had cooled. She drank it anyway. By the time she made it back to the main ICU, the monitors were blinking normally through the pre-dawn darkness, and the night was proceeding exactly as nights at Mercy General proceeded, quietly, routinely, with the hum of machines and the occasional beep of an alert that meant nothing serious, just a reminder that everything was still running. She had 3 more hours on her shift. 3 more hours of invisibility. 3 more hours before Dr. Hargrove's smile would come back to her in the gaps between thoughts, that particular expression that suggested he was watching her, waiting for something, ready to move when the time came. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had been expecting this. She had known, 18 months ago when she had arrived at Mercy General with a fresh credential and a nursing license and the kind of background that didn't quite exist if you looked at it too closely, that sooner or later someone would notice. Someone always noticed. And when they did, the only thing left was to decide how much of the truth was worth revealing, and how much of the past was worth staying buried. Margaret returned to room 314 just to check. Michael was sleeping, his breathing steady, his body healing in the careful, methodical way that bodies did when they had good medical care and no other major complications. She did not adjust anything that needed adjusting. She only stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the tattoo that was still partially visible beneath the bandages, and she thought about what it would mean if he ever managed to see her clearly. If the head trauma cleared completely. If he remembered. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, indifferent to her thoughts, and she moved back into the hallway to resume her shift. The cafeteria at Mercy General on a Tuesday afternoon smelled like industrial fryer oil and the particular staleness of reheated chicken. Margaret sat at the corner table during her lunch break, the one furthest from the main entrance, with a clear sight line to both doors. Habit. Her sandwich was turkey on wheat, nothing remarkable, and she ate with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else, each bite the same size, each chew exactly the same number of times. A woman at the next table noticed and looked away quickly. Dr. Hargrove entered like he owned the room. He was tall in the way that men who'd never been told no were tall, shoulders back, chin elevated, moving through the crowded cafeteria with the absolute certainty of someone whose presence would part the waters. He saw Margaret immediately. His eyes locked on her like a predator identifying prey that had gotten too close to the territory line. He didn't approach her first. Instead, he moved to the table with 4 residents and 2 attending physicians, the power table, the one where decisions were made, and he stood at the head of it like a general addressing troops. "I'll bet anyone here $20, Hargrove said, his voice pitched to carry, that Nurse Walsh quits within a week. Look at her. That's the burnout shuffle. I've seen it 100 times. The eyes give it away, they're already gone." He gestured toward Margaret with his coffee cup like she was a lab specimen under glass. "What do you think, Dr. Martinez? Week? 10 days. Laughter rippled through the break tables. Not the warm kind. The kind that made people feel small. One of the residents, a young man with expensive loafers that squeaked on the tile floor, actually snickered and said, "I'd take that bet, sir. She looks like she might crack today." Margaret's hands didn't shake. Her sandwich didn't waver. She set down her fork with the same deliberate calm she'd used 1,000 times in operating theaters and on the tarmac at Kandahar when rounds were coming in hot. One measured breath. In through her nose, out through her mouth. The kind of breath that preceded action, not reaction. She looked at her sandwich. Then she looked at Hargrove, and she held his gaze without blinking. That's when he moved toward her table. His trajectory was casual, but his intent was surgical. He stepped slightly to his left, angled his right elbow, and struck her lunch tray with the kind of force that looked accidental if you weren't watching carefully. But Margaret was always watching carefully. Her plate, the turkey sandwich, the side of carrots, the open container of yogurt, cascaded toward the tile floor in slow motion. The plate shattered first. Then the contents. Soup scattered across her white Crocs, hot tomato bisque soaking through the fabric. The sandwich landed face down. A carrot rolled under the neighboring table. The fluorescent overhead lights caught the arc of the spill like stage lighting on a mistake. "Oops," Hargrove said, not moving to help, not apologizing, just smirking down at her like she'd fallen into a trap of her own making. "Better clean that up, sweetheart. Since you're so good at following orders." He said it loud enough for the corner section of the cafeteria to hear. The word "sweetheart" came out like he was scraping something off his shoe. Margaret crouched. The tile was cold against her knees. She could feel every eye in the cafeteria on her back, could taste the anticipation in the room, the expectation that she would cry, would stand up and defend herself, would give Hargrove the reaction he was hunting for. That was what predators needed. They needed the prey to run or fight back. Movement justified the kill. She didn't move fast. She moved like someone with time. Like someone who had already survived worse than a man with an inflated sense of importance and a lunch tray. She pulled napkins from her pocket. She always kept napkins, along with a trauma shear, along with a penlight, along with 7 other things that kept people alive, and she wiped the soup from her shoes with the same attention a surgeon would apply to closing an incision. One tear escaped her left eye as she crouched. Just one. The kind of tear that could be interpreted as sadness or frustration or anything the observer wanted it to mean. Then she wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with Hargrove, and she stood. Her voice came out level, measured, the voice of someone who had made decisions while taking fire. "I've been through worse mornings before my coffee, doctor." The room went dead silent. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them like they were the only sound that had ever existed. Hargrove's jaw tightened. His left eye twitched. He was expecting compliance. He was expecting tears. He was expecting fear. What he got instead was something his neural pathways didn't have a response for: absolute, terrifying calm. The kind of composure that comes from having already lost everything you could lose. "You're insubordinate," he said, but his voice had lost its edge. It sounded thin now, defensive. Like he was reading lines from a script he'd suddenly forgotten he was acting in. "No, sir," Margaret said quietly. She crouched again and picked up the remaining pieces of her lunch with deliberate care. "I'm just cleaning up." She deposited everything in the trash with methodical precision, then wiped down the floor with more napkins. When she stood, she was still holding his gaze. The room remained silent. Around them, residents and nurses looked at their trays. The power table suddenly became very interested in their soup. Hargrove left the cafeteria first. Not because Margaret dismissed him, but because staying meant acknowledging that his attempt at social dominance had collapsed into dust. He walked past her without another word, moving toward the door with the same brisk efficiency he'd entered with, but something had shifted in his posture. The certainty was gone. Replaced by something uglier, the calculation of a man who had just realized that the problem on his radar was not going to be easily removed. 2 days later, during morning rounds in front of 7 medical students and 3 residents, Hargrove threw the patient charts at Margaret's feet. Actually threw them. The motion was so sudden, so theatrical, that one of the students flinched. Papers cascaded across the linoleum like snow, some landing at her feet, others sliding under the supply carts. 23 charts, Margaret counted without looking. 23. "These are all out of order," Hargrove snapped, his voice carrying through the hallway. "Nurse Walsh, since you seem to have so much spare energy and composure, perhaps you could demonstrate your organizational skills for our students. Pick those up. Now." The medical students watched. This was the part where the attending teaches a lesson through humiliation. This was how hierarchies were established in medicine, through small cruelties, through the systematic erosion of anyone who occupied the space below you on the ladder. Margaret had seen it in the military too. It was the same everywhere. Power consolidation required an audience. She kneeled and began collecting the charts. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Every movement was precise, economical, the movement of someone who had practiced discipline until it became indistinguishable from her skeleton. The medical students watched her arrange the papers in perfect order, not the way Hargrove had them, but the way they should have been arranged. Alphabetical by patient name. Arranged by flaw. Checked for completeness. When she stood and handed the reassembled stack back to him, she didn't hand them to Hargrove. She handed them to the nearest resident, a woman with dark eyes and the kind of attention span that suggested she actually listened. And as she placed them in that resident's hands, she said quietly, "These billing codes don't match the procedures documented. The ones circled in red, specifically. Should I flag them for review?" Hargrove's face flushed a color that Margaret had only seen in a man's face once before, right before he realized he was going to lose a poker game with money he didn't have. The residents exchanged looks. One of them, the expensive loafers from the cafeteria, actually stepped backward as if distance might protect him from whatever reckoning was about to arrive. "You're out of line, nurse," Hargrove said, but his voice had lost all authority. It was just sound now. Sound without substance. "These are my cases. My decisions." "Of course, Doctor," Margaret said with the kind of respect that somehow sounded like a weapon. She stepped back into line, her posture perfect, her expression serene. But her sharp eyes, the eyes that had noticed phantom patients and kickback arrangements and the particular architecture of fraud, remained exactly where they were. On him. Waiting. That night, during her break, Margaret sat alone in the break room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, and she reviewed months of Dr. Hargrove's patient records on a computer terminal that should have been logged out but wasn't. The phantom patients were easy to spot once you knew what you were looking for. Medicare billing for procedures on patients who didn't exist. Kickback patterns with medical suppliers, expensive equipment billed at markup rates that made no medical sense. Inflated procedure codes that didn't match the documentation. $47,000 in suspicious billing over 6 months alone. Maybe more. She documented nothing. She didn't need to. The evidence was there, waiting for someone with the authority and the motivation to find it. She just closed the browser and finished her cold coffee. Through the break room's glass partition, Dr. Hargrove stood in the hallway, watching her. He'd been there long enough to see her working on the computer. His jaw was clenched. His hands were fists at his sides. And in that moment, Margaret understood something fundamental about the men who wielded power without earning it. They could sense when their kingdom was about to crack. They could smell the approaching end. He looked away first. The alarm started at 0300. 3 screams at once, the heart monitor, the blood pressure cuff cycling downward, the ventilator's warning chirp. Margaret was in room 314 before the overhead even finished announcing code blue. The SEAL lay motionless, his chest rising and falling in mechanical rhythm, his face the color of old concrete. She moved to the bedside in 3 strides and her hands already knew what her eyes were confirming. Muffled heart sounds. Blood pressure 68/42 and dropping. Jugular veins distended like cords, the skin around his neck swollen tight. Cardiac tamponade. Blood pooling in the pericardium, the sac around his heart, compressing it with every beat until the organ couldn't fill properly. Another 30 seconds and his heart would arrest. Another 60 and he'd be dead. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway, his white coat still pristine from his evening rounds. He saw the crashing vitals on the monitor and his body went still. His mouth moved but no words came. The fluorescent light overhead hummed its blank indifferent hum as the silence stretched, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Margaret was already moving. She grabbed the crash cart's emergency kit, her muscle memory taking over like an engine igniting. 14-gauge needle. 16 centimeters of stainless steel designed for exactly one purpose. She swabbed his left subclavicular space with betadine, the orange liquid spreading across his chest in a careful arc, the chemical smell sharp and metallic in the cold room. Hargrove's eyes were on her, watching, frozen. She positioned the needle at the angle, a precise entry point just below the clavicle, aiming toward the tip of the left scapula. His blood pressure hit 62. The monitor beeped its urgent rhythm, a sound like a digital scream. Margaret's breath was controlled, one slow inhale, one slow exhale. Her hands were steady as surgical steel. She'd done this procedure 8 times before, though not in any civilian hospital and never with an attending physician watching her every movement. The needle slid through skin, through fascia, through the pericardial membrane. The resistance changed. She felt it, that subtle shift in tissue density that meant she'd reached the fluid. Blood came back into the syringe. Dark red, almost black, the color of a stopped clock. She drew it out in careful pulls, 20 milliliters, 30, 40. The monitor's beeping slowed. The blood pressure climbed. 68. 72. 85. His heart was breathing again, expanding with each beat, the tamponade releasing like pressure escaping from a balloon. By the time she'd withdrawn 80 milliliters, his O2 saturation was climbing past 90%. Sinus rhythm. Beautiful, stable sinus rhythm. The SEAL's color shifted from ashen to something human again. A technician burst through the door with a crash cart but stopped short, seeing a nurse standing over an open emergency with a used syringe in her hand and the patient already stabilizing. Hargrove's expression had shifted. Not relief. Not gratitude. Something colder. Calculation, pure and thin. He looked at the blood on her gloves, at the needle she was disposing of, at the SEAL's now stable vital signs, and his jaw tightened. He didn't thank her. He didn't acknowledge what she'd just done. He simply turned and walked out of the ICU, his footsteps a rhythm of decisions being made in the dark. Margaret stayed with the SEAL for the next hour while the cardiologists reviewed his imaging and prepared for an echocardiogram. His eyes fluttered open around 0430, still glazed from sedation but conscious. He looked at her and his head turned slowly, tracking movement like his brain was learning to work again. Did we meet? His voice was gravel and morphine. You look like. He trailed off, confusion clouding his expression. The head trauma was still there, eating memories like rust. She didn't tell him. She just adjusted his fore and said, rest. He closed his eyes and obeyed, and she wondered if that was mercy or cruelty, watching someone you'd saved look directly through you. At 0600, with the SEAL sleeping and stable, with his ejection fraction now 48% and climbing, with every monitor green and breathing easy, Margaret sat at the nursing station documenting the pericardiocentesis. The procedure that would save his life. The procedure that was going to destroy hers. She could feel it coming the way you feel a pressure system moving in, a change in the air itself, a knowledge that the weather was turning. The doors to the ICU exploded open at 0230 hours on her next shift, though the violence started long before that, in the parking lot, in the brother's truck where grief had been metastasizing for 3 days straight. The man who came through those doors was 43 years old and covered in the salt stain of dried tears. His eyes were red-rimmed, pupils dilated, his clothing wrinkled in ways that suggested he hadn't changed or slept since his brother's death, a death that had nothing to do with the SEAL in room 314 and everything to do with a surgical complication at a hospital in Oceanside 3 weeks prior. But grief doesn't track facts. Grief tracks blame. Grief looks for faces to scream at. He was screaming before security even registered movement. You killed him. You killed my brother, you butchers, you murdered him. His voice was raw, shredded, the sound of someone who'd spent 3 days rehearsing words that would never be enough. He pushed past a security guard who was still processing the breach. Margaret saw the knife before anyone else did, a kitchen knife, 8 inches of blade, the edge catching the fluorescent light in a way that made everything suddenly, crystallinely clear. Time didn't slow. That was a lie people told themselves. Time stayed exactly the same speed. It was fear that created the illusion of slowness. The SEAL was sedated. Vulnerable. Defenseless as a child. Margaret moved. Not toward the alarm. Not toward security. Toward the bed. She stepped into the space between the man and the sleeping patient, her body an obstacle, her hands rising in the language her body had learned in 1,000 scenarios she'd tried to forget. The knife went in her left shoulder first, a burning puncture that drove her backward but not away. She grabbed the man's wrist with her right hand, her fingers closing around the tendons and bones with the kind of pressure that came from memory, from muscle trained in restraint and control. He screamed something incoherent and drove downward again, and the blade found her right side, above the hip, sliding between ribs with a sensation like white fire opening inside her chest. She didn't let go. Her left arm wrapped around his torso. Her right hand twisted the knife hand outward, away from the seal. Blood, her blood, warm and immediate, soaked through her scrubs and ran down her spine. The smell of it was copper and salt. Her vision had a tunnel to it, red at the edges, but her hand stayed locked. 8 seconds. That's what the security footage would show later, though it felt like minutes, hours, the kind of eternity that exists in the spaces between heartbeats. Her grip on his wrist was something from another life, trained by drill instructors who'd taught her to hold on even after the pain tried to convince her to let go. Security arrived like an avalanche. 2 officers grabbed the man's torso. A third tackled his legs. The knife fell to the linoleum floor with a sound like a bell. Margaret's hands released. Her legs kept her upright for 1 more second, then her knees decided they were done and she sat down, hard, on the edge of the SEAL's bed. Her left hand moved to her right side and found wetness, heat, the world going slightly soft at the edges. Her scrubs were blue, then dark blue, then black with blood. A nurse screamed. Another ran for the emergency cart. The intercom crackled with overhead pages. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the ICU entrance, his expression unreadable, his eyes moving from Margaret's wound to her face to the SEAL to the blood pooling beneath her on the floor. She pressed her hand harder against her side and tried to steady her breathing. The edges of her vision were closing in like curtains being drawn. "Patient secure," she said, her voice strange and distant, like it was coming from somewhere else, someone else. "Check his vitals. Full assessment." The SEAL slept on, unaware, untouched, alive. That was what mattered. That was the only metric that counted. By the time the ER finished stitching the shoulder wound and the side laceration, 47 stitches total, the blade had missed her spleen by ½ centimeter. The doctor said it in a low voice like it was a religious miracle. By the time she was bandaged and wrapped and sitting on the examination table in a hospital gown watching her blood-soaked scrubs get bagged for the police report, Hargrove had already made his calls. Margaret could see it in the way hospital administration appeared in the ER doorway with HR accompanying them, in the way they didn't ask if she was all right, in the way they looked at her the way you look at a broken machine. She'd heard him, though. Earlier, in the ICU, before security had fully subdued the man. Heard him on the phone in the hallway. Words like provoked, unauthorized procedure, unstable personality, liability we cannot afford. By morning, there was a report filed with hospital administration alleging that Margaret's aggressive response to the situation had escalated the patient's family member and put hospital staff at additional risk. Another report suggested that the emergency pericardiocentesis she performed without explicit physician authorization constituted scope of practice violation and patient endangerment. A third arrived from Dr. Hargrove himself, a detailed account of how he'd observed concerning psychiatric symptoms in this staff member over the past several days and felt obligated to report her for potential substance abuse and fitness for duty concerns. The blade had gone through her twice. The paperwork was aiming for her throat. She signed the termination documents without reading them. The HR director offered her a box for her personal items. Margaret collected a cracked coffee mug from the break room, a gift from a colleague 3 years prior, a joke about running on caffeine and chaos, and a dying succulent she'd kept on her locker shelf, and a faded photograph of her unit taken in 2018 at Forward Operating Base Shank in Logar Province. 23 of the 34 men in that photo were dead now. Half of them by their own hands when they came home. The other half to IEDs, ambushes, the simple mathematics of war. She put them in the cardboard box and carried them to the staff parking lot, where the rain had started, the kind of rain that fell on San Diego maybe 3 times a year, enough to remind the city what weather could be when it actually tried. The bus stop was a shelter with no walls, just a roof and the smell of wet concrete. She sat on the bench and held the box against her chest and let the rain soak her hair because she'd left her jacket in her locker and didn't have the energy to care. Her shoulder hurt. Her side hurt worse. The sutures pulled when she moved. In 48 hours she would be standing in this same rain wearing these same bandages, holding this same box, wondering how you survive when you'd already survived so much that survival had stopped feeling like an option and started feeling like a punishment. The SEAL would wake up tomorrow and ask the nurses his questions about combat, and none of them would have the answer, because the only person who could answer him was a woman with a cardboard box standing in the rain at a bus stop that served the part of the city where nobody asked your name. 48 hours. That's how long the cardboard box lasted before the rain started eating through the bottom. Margaret stood 6 blocks from Mercy General, watching her bus pull toward the curb through sheets of water that hammered the street like machine gun fire. Inside the box, a cracked coffee mug from the break room she'd stolen her first night, a dying succulent that had sat on her locker for 3 months, its leaves curling inward like hands surrendering, and a photograph in a plastic sleeve. 23 faces in desert camouflage standing in front of a HESCO barrier. Her unit. Alpha Team, 3rd Platoon. 12 of them had come home in flag-draped cases. The others didn't come home at all. The bandages under her jacket pulled tight when she breathed. The knife wounds had been cleaned, stitched, wrapped in layers of gauze that now carried the faint smell of antiseptic and old blood. Her shoulder burned. Her side burned worse. Neither pain was the worst thing she'd survived, which meant both wounds would heal faster than the part of her that had already decided this job was over before the blade ever went in. She'd walked into Mercy General at 0700 that morning despite the bandages. Showed up. Clocked in. Moved through the corridors like a ghost already evicted from the living world. The SEAL in room 314 had been sleeping. Dr. Hargrove had not. He'd watched her from the nursing station with eyes that looked different now, not contemptuous, not mocking. Calculating. Like someone watching a legal liability walk past him in scrubs. By 0900, the phone calls had started. Margaret didn't know about the calls. Not yet. She would learn about them slowly, the way you learn your house has been broken into, not all at once, but piece by piece as things went missing. First a shift. Then an assignment. Then the way people looked at her with mouths that wanted to speak but didn't. Dr. Hargrove had called the hospital board president at 0745. We have a serious situation with a staff nurse. Unauthorized procedure. Patient endangerment. I need to discuss liability before the attorneys get involved. The board president owed him a favor from 3 years ago, a recommendation letter that had gotten his daughter into Hopkins. Favors were currency in hospital politics, and Hargrove spent them like a man about to go bankrupt. Then came the reference calls. At 10:30, a woman from the hospital's HR department had phoned the number on Margaret's application under previous employment experience. The phone rang at a clinic in Portland that had closed for years ago. The answering service picked up, automated, dead. Wrong number. But Margaret had anticipated this. She'd put that clinic on the application because it would be impossible to verify. Careful preparation, the kind of thoroughness that kept her cover intact. Except the HR woman didn't stop there. She called the number again. Called 3 more clinics. Called the Veterans Affairs Hospital in Seattle. Each conversation the same, do you have records of a Margaret Walsh? Nursing credentials? References? Each time getting nothing. No trail. No witnesses. No one to say Margaret Walsh had ever existed in the nursing world before Mercy General. That lack of verifiable history was itself a red flag the size of an aircraft carrier. By noon, Hargrove had made calls to 2 outside investigators, the kind of consultants hospitals hired when they suspected fraud or license violations. I want a full background investigation on the nurse who performed the unauthorized procedure. 12 hours. I don't care about cost. The investigators started digging. Military service? Nothing in public records. Prior nursing positions? Gaps that looked like missing persons cases. Social media? A Facebook account created 2 years ago with no photos and 4 friends. The whole profile of someone who didn't want to be found, which to an investigator looks identical to someone with something to hide. By 14:30, Hargrove was in the hospital administrator's office with his findings, his narrative already written. She performed a procedure outside her scope of practice. She provoked the family member who attacked the patient. She's brought liability and reputational damage to this institution. I recommend immediate termination and full legal review. Margaret didn't know any of this yet. She'd worked her shift like someone operating on borrowed time, moving through patient rooms with the efficiency of muscle memory, checking monitors and adjusting medications and charting notes with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that details saved lives. At 1600, she'd clocked out and showered in the break room bathroom, carefully unwrapping her shoulder to check the stitches. Still holding. No infection. The wound itself was already beginning to fade from the violent red of fresh injury into the duller purple of healing tissue. She dressed in street clothes, jeans, a jacket loose enough to move in, boots laced tight. She'd packed her locker methodically. The cracked mug because it had been her first cup of coffee at Mercy. The succulent because it had needed a home and her locker had seemed like the only place in the hospital where anything ever actually rested. The photograph because leaving it would mean forgetting, and forgetting would mean those 12 faces had died for nothing. By 1730, she was walking toward administration. The administrative office smelled like expensive coffee and the faint chemical burn of a new carpet installation. Margaret sat across from a man named Brennan who had never spoken to her before and who clearly didn't want to speak to her now. Hargrove stood beside him, arms crossed, radiating the satisfaction of a man who had successfully removed a thorn from his side. "Ms. Walsh," Brennan said, not looking directly at her. "We've completed our investigation into the incident that occurred on your shift. We've determined that your actions violated standard protocols and caused significant liability exposure to this hospital. We're going to have to let you go. Effective immediately. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your address on file. We'd appreciate if you turn in your badge and your access card." Margaret didn't speak. Hargrove waited for her to defend herself. She could see it in his face, the hunger for her to break, to rage, to prove that his narrative had been accurate. "She's unstable. She's dangerous. Look how she reacts to termination." Instead, Margaret simply reached down and unclipped her badge from her jeans. The plastic hospital ID with her face looking back at her, Margaret Walsh, registered nurse. A name she'd invented. A life she'd borrowed. Both ending right now. She set the badge on the desk. She set the access card beside it. Then she stood up and walked out without speaking. The walk to the break room to clear her locker took 90 seconds. No one made eye contact. The word had spread already. She'd been fired, terminated, removed, eliminated, expunged from the roster like an infection the hospital's immune system had finally recognized and destroyed. People who'd worked beside her for 18 months suddenly became very interested in their phones. She gathered her cardboard box, the one she'd brought her personal items in on her first day, and placed the coffee mug in it carefully, the succulent, the photograph. The bottom of the box had already begun to soften from being stored in the break room's humid air. She could feel the degradation, the disintegration, the way everything eventually fell apart if you gave it enough time and exposure. Outside, the rain had started. She walked 6 blocks to the nearest bus stop. The sidewalk glistened like a wound. Cars hissed past, their tires throwing up water that soaked the bottom of her jeans. She stood under the bus shelter, which offered almost no protection, watching the cardboard box slowly collapse under the weight of the weather and whatever else the world insisted on pressing down. 12 years of service. For deployments into places with names that sounded like music played in minor keys. Kandahar. Fallujah. 3 provinces that would never leave her bones. She'd carried men twice her size out of burning buildings. She'd treated wounds with her hands shaking from adrenaline and lack of sleep and the knowledge that someone was shooting at her. She'd saved lives in conditions that would make most civilian nurses faint into their own scrubs. She'd earned a Navy Cross for carrying 3 SEALs out of a compound that was being systematically dismantled by rocket fire, moving low and fast and without any regard for the fact that her body was bleeding in 4 different places. And then came the 4th deployment. She didn't like to think about the 4th deployment. The PTSD after it had worn her like water wears stone, persistent, patient, impossible to stop. Every sound a gunshot. Every crowd a potential ambush. Every moment of peace a lie that would be corrected soon enough. She'd tried the VA therapy. She'd tried the medications. They made everything feel like she was experiencing life through thick plastic, safe but suffocating. The only thing that had helped was leaving. Burning every bridge. Telling no one, not even her family. Becoming Margaret Walsh instead of whoever she'd been before the war, before the wait, before her hands learned the temperature of another person's blood. She'd chosen this. The anonymity. The quiet. The night shifts where she could be useful in small ways without the pressure of command, without the weight of knowing that her decisions meant someone's body came home in a flag or came home breathing. And now even this was taken. The bus pulled up to the stop. Margaret didn't get on. She watched it pass, its windows fogged with the breath of commuters who had somewhere to be. She was nowhere. She had no address that meant anything. No family to call. No unit to return to. The 12 people in that photograph, half were deceased. The other half wouldn't recognize her if she walked up and said her rank. You don't just disappear from people's lives for 4 years and expect them to still be people you know. She waited for the next bus. Inside Mercy General, 17 blocks away and closing, something was happening that Margaret couldn't know yet. Something was already in motion that had begun the moment the SEAL from room 314 opened his eyes and asked about the officer who had saved his life. Something that had accelerated when the Marine veteran in the hospital's IT department, Chen, a man who'd spent 3 tours recognizing the look of military sacrifice in civilian places, sat down at his terminal and noticed something curious. Dr. Hargrove's user account had just attempted to access the security footage from the past 72 hours. Then delete it. Then delete the backup. Then delete the deletion log. Except Chen had been watching. Chen had seen the deletion attempt. And Chen, who understood better than anyone what it meant to protect people who'd already given everything, had already started making copies. Already started dialing numbers. Already started setting in motion a sequence of events that would begin with the rumble of diesel engines and end with 75 Navy SEALs marching through the automatic doors of Mercy General Hospital at 18:30 hours sharp. But Margaret didn't know that yet. She just stood in the rain, holding a collapsing cardboard box, watching the street lights flicker to life as the afternoon died into evening. Her bandages were soaked now. Her wounds were beginning to throb in a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. Her bus arrived. This time she got on. She climbed the steps with the deliberate care of someone whose body was held together by more bandages than skin. She found a seat in the back. She set the box down carefully. The bus pulled away from the curb. She didn't know that her former patient was at this exact moment being dressed in a dress uniform by his daughter, who was crying because her dad said he finally remembered the nice nurse who'd carried him to the helicopter. She didn't know that a SEAL commander in dress blues was already driving north on Interstate 5 with 16 vehicles full of warriors in his convoy, all of them answering a question that had been asked quietly, "Do any of you remember Senior Chief Walsh?" She didn't know that her military file was being printed at that moment, that her decorations were being prepared for public pronouncement, that the thing she'd been trying to hide for 4 years was about to become impossible to hide anymore. She just watched the rain stream down the bus windows and held the cardboard box that contained everything she'd managed to salvage from a life that had ended twice now, once in Kandahar and again today in an administrator's office. The bus turned a corner. Somewhere in the darkness, the sound of large diesel engines became audible, a deep, rolling rumble that a trained ear would recognize as convoy protocol. Formation. Synchronized. The kind of sound that had once meant she was going to war. The kind of sound that was about to change everything. The rumble started low, underneath everything else, a rhythm Margaret's bones recognized before her mind could name it. Diesel engines, multiple vehicles, coordinated timing. The kind of sound that meant formation. The kind of sound that meant purpose. She was still at the bus stop when the first truck turned onto the hospital drive. 17 vehicles rolled into Mercy General's parking lot in perfect diamond formation, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn dark like searchlights. Not ambulances. Not hospital transports. Military trucks. Black Hawks and logistics vehicles, each one painted the color of professional intent. The lead vehicle, an up-armored Humvee with markings she recognized, pulled parallel to the main entrance and stopped with the precision of pilots who measured distances in meters and milliseconds. Margaret watched from half a block away, the cardboard box still in her arms, rain soaking through the bottom corner. She didn't move. Couldn't move. That was a JSOC tier convoy. That was the sound of somewhere between 70 and 100 operators, moving together. The lobby doors at Mercy General opened. 75 Navy SEALs in dress uniforms poured through like a dark tide, pressed blue dress uniforms with ribbons, creased trousers, polished boots that clicked against the tile in perfect unison. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. Dozens of them moving together with the kind of synchronization that only comes from going to war together, from bleeding together, from standing in the gap for each other when everything else fails. The night shift staff froze. A nurse at the desk stood up so quickly her chair rolled backward. The SEAL commander stepped forward, a man with the bearing of someone who had given orders that ended in either success or funerals, and who had learned to live with both outcomes. His dress uniform carried 3 rows of ribbons. His eyes were grey as winter water. He approached the front desk with the calm of someone accustomed to impossible situations resolving in his favor. Senior Chief Walsh. Not a question. A statement. We're here to collect her. The desk nurse's mouth opened. No sound came out. From the middle of the formation, a man stepped forward. The SEAL from room 314. Finally lucid. Finally himself. His face was weathered in the way that comes from high altitude and hard decisions, his eyes sharp now with recognition and something else, gratitude, maybe, or something deeper than that. Something that looked like coming home. He was holding something in his hands. Margaret could see it from half a block away, even through the rain. Combat boots. Her boots. Battered. Cracked at the heel. Scuffed to hell from deployments in Kandahar and Helmand province. She had given them to him 3 days ago in the hospital corridor when she found him staring at his own shredded footwear, and she had never asked for them back. A girl stepped forward from behind him, 6 years old, maybe 7, with his eyes. She wore a pink rain jacket that was too big for her shoulders. My daddy says you're a senior chief petty officer. The words hung in the lobby air like a prayer. Inside the hospital, a staff nurse, Jennifer, the one who always brought Margaret coffee during double shifts, approached Dr. Hargrove's office. She was carrying a tablet. Her hands were shaking. She read from Margaret's military file, voice cracking on every other word. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret and Walsh, Service Number, Kandahar, Helmand Province, Combat Rotations. The words came out halting, broken, like she was speaking across a distance measured in more than just years. 3 Purple Hearts. The SEAL commander stepped beside her. His voice was different now, ceremonial, formal, the kind of voice used when honoring the fallen or welcoming home the saved. Navy Cross. Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor. Combat Medical Badge. Air Assault School. Survival, Evasion, Resistance, Escape Certification. He paused between each one, letting the words settle. 17 emergency procedures performed under direct enemy fire. 43 personnel extracted under her direction. 0 fatalities under her watch. The lobby didn't go quiet. It went hollow. The absence of sound became a presence all its own. Dr. Hargrove's face went white, not the pale of illness, but the color of a man watching his entire constructed reality collapse simultaneously. He tried to speak. This is highly irregular, you can't just. The SEAL commander turned toward him with the speed of a predator recognizing prey, and something in his eyes, something that had watched people die and had made peace with that weight, made Hargrove's mouth close. 2 FBI agents in dark suits entered through the main entrance doors. They moved like men who had done this before, who knew exactly which words to use and in what order to make careers end. The lead agent surveyed the lobby, found his target, and approached with the casual authority of federal authority backed by 12 years of investigations. "We're investigating healthcare fraud at this facility. Dr. Hargrove, you're coming with us." Hargrove's voice jumped an octave. "I don't know what you think you've found, but I have board authorization for every." A man stepped forward from the gathered staff, Marcus Chen, the hospital's marine IT specialist, holding a tablet like it was evidence at the end of the world. "Because it was. You tried to delete security footage 40 minutes ago, Doctor. I preserved everything." Chen's voice was steady. "Military. The billing fraud. The phantom Medicare patients. The kickback invoices from medical suppliers. All of it. Also the footage of you watching Nurse Walsh get stabbed and calculating how to use it against her. That's the part one want to highlight for the agents. That's the part that matters." The hospital CEO appeared from the back offices, flanked by 2 lawyers in suits that cost more than Margaret's annual salary. His face was the color of someone who had just realized his institution's reputation was about to be flattened. Board members stood in clusters, whispering frantically, backing away from Hargrove the way schools of fish flee when a shark enters the water. Hargrove's hands began to shake. Not trembling, shaking. The trembling of a man watching years of carefully constructed protection collapse like a building with its supports cut out. The board chairman he'd called in favors from turned away. The outside investigator he'd hired to destroy Margaret's credibility wouldn't return calls. The protection he'd built through years of strategic donations and political maneuvering was evaporating like rain on hot asphalt. A resident, a young woman Margaret had trained, who had watched her work, spoke up from the growing crowd. "He told me to chart procedures he never performed. I have documentation." Another nurse followed. Then another. Then the weight of evidence became a wave, and everyone was either part of it or being drowned by it. Hargrove pointed at Margaret with desperate anger. She had no authority to perform that pericardiocentesis, she violated every protocol. The SEAL commander moved between them without appearing to move, the way trained violence becomes simply presence. His voice was ice-cold, the kind of cold that comes from standing watch in Kandahar while the temperature dropped below zero and the enemy didn't stop coming. "Senior Chief Walsh has performed emergency pericardiocentesis under direct enemy fire 17 times. 17. He let that number sit. My men are alive because of her. The patient in your ICU is alive because she ignored you. Because she knew what mattered and you only knew what protected you." Hargrove's mouth opened and closed silently. A fish on dry land. He tried to meet Margaret's eyes and couldn't do it. Security stepped forward, 2 officers who had spent 18 months watching him belittle the staff, watching him throw his weight around, watching him destroy good people for the crime of being competent. They escorted him toward the FBI agents. His silk tie was crooked now. His perfect facade had shattered into component pieces. He passed Margaret on the way out, and he could not meet her eyes. The rain outside had softened to mist. The military convoy sat idling in the parking lot, 75 Navy SEALs standing in formation, and the SEAL from room 314 held out the combat boots toward the woman who had saved his life twice, once in a combat zone thousands of miles away, and once in a hospital room where nobody thought to ask her name. "Welcome home, Senior Chief," the commander said. The room went quiet in a way that meant something sacred had just been restored. Margaret set down the cardboard box. Her hands were steady. They had been steady for 18 months while she pushed a mop and checked vitals and listened to a man mock her. They had been steady while she saved a patient's life. They had been steady while she bled defending someone who didn't even know her name. Now they picked up the boots. The leather was still warm from the SEAL's hands. The laces were frayed. One heel had a chunk missing from a mission that would have its own story, its own scars, its own reasons why some people never forget where they came from. She held them the way soldiers hold colors. From the lobby doors, the SEAL from room 314 smiled, and for the first time, Margaret saw recognition there. Not just of her, but of what she was. What she had always been. A senior chief petty officer. A combat medic. Someone who had sworn an oath and lived it out in a hospital corridor, pushing back against darkness one patient at a time. His daughter stepped forward and held Margaret's free hand without being asked, like she understood something about broken people coming home that most adults never learned. Subscribe to witness more stories of hidden strength revealed. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated, and if you've ever had the chance to prove everyone wrong. Share this with someone who needs to know that true heroism isn't always visible until the moment it matters most.